Hey all you well-protected folks out there, I'm Jalan from Sophos Support, and today we're looking at best practices for configuring your threat protection policy in Sophos Central. Intercept X is a powerful product. It's got multiple layers of protection to protect against lots of different threat vectors and doesn't rely on one specific form of scanning. This is great because now the bad guys are up against a whole fortress of defense instead of just traditional signature-based antivirus. Misconfigured policies lead to breaches in that threat protection fortress. You can find yourself defenseless when the bad guys attack and in a position you do not want to be in as the IT guy. Don't worry, today we're going to break down the threat protection policy so that you can configure your policy as securely as possible. Before we jump into the policy, we need to talk about multi-factor authentication, or MFA. With MFA turned on, logging into Central will require a second factor. We have different options available like Google Authenticator or SMS codes. Pick the one that works best for you. MFA makes it harder for a bad actor to compromise your account because they need access to that second factor and can't just guess or brute force your password. Access to your dashboard is the most important safety system you have, so don't let it fall into the wrong hands. To turn on MFA, go to Global Settings and scroll down to Multi-Factor Authentication. We recommend enabling all admins need MFA. Check out the video description for further documentation on MFA in Sophos Central. Now let's jump into the threat protection policy in Endpoint, Policies, and I'll select my test policy, which I've already assigned to a few users, and go into the Settings tab. Now these settings are going to look a little different in the endpoint policy versus the server policy. For the most part, the settings are identical, but placement of settings is a little bit different. We'll go through the endpoint policy first, then cover the differences in the server policy. Now right off the jump, we see Use Recommended Settings. Perfect. Leave that turned on and your organization is in great hands. As long as you've installed Intercept X on the devices in your environment, they'll get a policy that we deem secure today and we'll update it accordingly when we add new features in the future. Now there's more to the policy like scheduled system scans, device isolation, and exclusions, but we'll talk about those in a minute. Let's break down some of these recommended settings for now in the case that you ever do actually need to deviate from the recommendations. Live Protection allows for the antivirus to look up the latest threat information from Sophos Labs online on items that are being scanned. Deep learning is machine learning or AI that can detect threats without the use of traditional signatures. It scans portable executable files or PEs before execution and provides a confidence score on if the PE is malicious or not. This scan is fast and is always done on a PE even if you've excluded it, but if you did exclude the PE, it'll disregard the result of the scan and allow the PE through. We test the detection model extensively before release to reduce the number of false positives, but there's a small chance they can still happen. More info on reporting false positives in the description below. Real-time scanning is your primary protection on the device. It actually determines if the endpoint will actually scan the PE at execution. This includes in order the reputation scan, the deep learning scanner, the traditional signature-based scan, and the application control scan. If you turn the setting off, all those other elements won't work. Why do we have so many scans? It's like a stack of sifts. Some scans are better at detecting different types of things or are more efficient. Stacking them together means that if a detection happens at one layer, we don't proceed down to the next. That allows us to both optimize protection and performance. Remediation is what actions to take once a threat is actually detected. We can see the Enable Threat Case Creation slider is on, which means that when a threat is detected in the Threat Analysis Center in threat cases, we'll see entries that look like this. Threat cases are incredibly beneficial when investigating what happened when dealing with an infection, so you'll want to keep that turned on. Keep in mind though, not every detection will generate a threat case. We've included some more documentation on threat cases in the video description. The runtime protection settings are your active exploit protection, monitoring behavior after files have been executed and they're trying to do damage. Active exploits are actions that known good applications can be forced to take, which can be malicious. Think of macros in Word docs. Word is a good application and won't be stopped by our PE scanning. However, the macro that you just loaded makes it call PowerShell to edit your local environment variables, changing the path for File Explorer to a malicious PE that came bundled with the Word doc. Basically, active exploit mitigation looks at what an application is doing and determines if that action is malicious or of concern, regardless of what PE or process is doing the action. We recommend all of these settings be turned on. Let's briefly go over them, but you can find more detailed information on them in the video description. CryptoGuard is your main ransomware protection for document files, which are commonly targeted. It looks at specific file extensions and is triggered if a PE or process changes more than a threshold number of files in a specific time period. That change results in suspicious alteration to the file, like the file is deleted or the extension was changed. Protect from Master Boot Record ransomware protects devices from ransomware that encrypts the MBR, which may prevent startup, and from attacks that wipe the hard disk. Protect critical functions in web browsing. Safe browsing protects web browsers from being exploited. Keep in mind though, this isn't download protection or web control. Those are important layers of security as well, which you can configure in the web control policy. More info on the web control policy in the video description. Going to a website that downloads a malicious PE won't be stopped by this. Instead, it's looking for things like JavaScript injections, SQL cross-site scripting, and other exploits that the website may force your web browser to action on your device. Mitigate exploits in vulnerable applications and protect processes protects applications and processes that are most prone to exploitation. We have options for which type to protect, but yeah, we recommend turning them all on. Again, these are common exploitation vectors like Java, Office docs, and so on. These applications aren't malicious, it's the data being fed into them making them do something malicious. CPU branch tracing is specific to Intel processors and allows for tracing the processor activity for detections. The settings highlighted in blue are new features we've either just released into the software or features that are only available for the early access programs. So if the settings say join the EAP now, they only apply to devices in the EAP. The advanced settings contain some options more for troubleshooting that we strongly recommend leaving as default. These settings can turn off features that open major vulnerabilities, so you don't really want to be playing around in there. Device isolation is designed to prevent the lateral movement of malware such as worms onto critical infrastructure. It injects a block into the network stack of a device when a red health status is detected. No network traffic will be allowed from that device except to Sophos or defined devices and ports that you configured in this policy. That can be great for malware infections, but since things like update failures and missing services will also trigger device isolation, you have to balance against user experience and your security posture. Only turn the setting on for systems that have access to critical areas of your network. We've included further documentation in the description on device isolation, so check that out before turning it on. Scheduled scans aren't as important as they used to be, so we don't set them for any time by default. Because of real-time scanning and the background scanner that's always running, there's not as much need for a full system scan. If you're using full system scans, keep in mind that scanning archive files will significantly slow it down, so it's best to leave that off. Remember that a malicious PE can't execute from inside an archive, so when the archive is extracted, we then scan the contents and we'll catch it then. It's also important to note that if a scan is triggered before another full system scan completes, it'll actually end the first scan. So you should account for how long it takes to actually scan your devices. One scan a week outside of working hours is generally enough. Now into the danger zone we go with exclusions. In some situations, exclusions may be unavoidable. Try to use a scalpel when making exclusions and not a hammer. What we mean by this is try to be as exact and precise as possible. Don't exclude entire drives. Exclude specific files and detections instead of entire folders. We do health checks on customers and sometimes see things like the D through H drives excluded, which is very risky. Remember, any PE that falls under an exclusion will have no restrictions when running. It'll be able to do anything malicious that it wants. Before making exclusions, read through the documentation on scanning exclusions, and while making exclusions, read the exclusion description that's displayed to make sure you're using the right type of exclusion. For example, if active exploit mitigation detects a threat, it'll show up in the detected exploits option. Trying to make a file or folder exclusion for that detection won't work because that applies to the real-time scanning, not active exploit mitigation. If you're putting exclusions into your policy, create a separate policy for the users or devices that need those exclusions if possible, so you can minimize the scope of that exclusion. We've seen some pretty messy situations due to improper use of exclusions, and we don't want that to happen to you, so be careful. Switching over to the server side of things, while all the settings are pretty much the same, they're ordered a little bit differently. Basically, all the InterceptX advanced features live at the top, while the standard protection features live underneath. If you have the InterceptX Advanced license, enable all the advanced features for full protection. When you create a new policy, all the recommended settings will be turned on, but the InterceptX Advanced options don't have the same Use Recommended Settings checkbox we saw on the endpoint side or on the server protection default features side of things. Server protection can be a bit more sensitive than endpoint, so you may need to change some of these settings to optimize performance. Again, all these settings are the same as what I mentioned for endpoint, and for further info on server protection, check out the documentation in the video description. Well, that is all the time I have today, folks. Hope you found this video useful. Let us know by hitting the thumbs and giving us some feedback on TechVids or YouTube in the comments. Check out the in-depth documentation for this video by clicking here or in the video description, and check out techvids.sophos.com if you haven't already for more great videos like this one. Have fun configuring, and now more than ever, folks, stay safe out there.